Welcome to our discussion on presidential elections. These are the topics for our look at presidential elections. What are different types of primaries and caucuses, and what are their purpose? What happens at the national party conventions? What is the Electoral College? And what are critical or realigning elections? What an awesome set of topics. Here we go. As an introduction, no other election in American politics can compare to the presidential election. It happens every 4 years. Primaries and caucuses are held in the winter and spring of that election year. Then there's a party convention, a national convention that takes place in the summertime. And then in November, there are 50 separate state elections on that first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And then the Electoral College happens. And the president is then elected and then sworn into office, inaugurated in January. So let's take it piece by piece. Let's start with the primary and caucuses. And we heard in the last discussion that primaries select the candidates. So if there's multiple people who want to be the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate for president, there has to be a process to decide who is actually going to get to represent the party. So in presidential elections, the primaries and the caucuses elect delegates to the party's national convention. And the party's national convention is where the party nominates their candidate. And the person who gets to be nominated is the one who does the best in the primaries and the caucuses. The state party organization selects what type of primary or caucus the state is going to have, or that party is going to have. So here are the different types of primaries that can be used to determine who the candidate will be in a presidential election at the party's national convention. There is a winner-take-all primary, where the candidate who wins the most votes in a state's primary gets all those delegates from that state at the convention. It is not used by Democrats, it's used by Republicans because it does allow a candidate to amass the required number of delegates quickly. Some people say they're maybe unfair because if a candidate wins a state primary by one vote, then that candidate would get all the delegates from that state, and the person who lost by just one vote would not get any. There is also a proportional representation primary, where the candidates who secure a threshold percentage, usually some sort of minimum, something about 15% is a typical minimum, then they are awarded delegates in proportion to the number of votes won. So in that example where a candidate wins by one vote, the person who lost by one vote would still get a good number of delegates. This is the system favored by the Democrats it's a 15% threshold in congressional districts. It may be fair, but it does make accruing the required number of delegates more challenging. And finally, a caucus is something that's been going through a change in the last 50 years, where party members meet in small groups throughout a state to select the party's delegates to the national convention. It's much more informal than the actual primary, where votes are cast. States have recently shifted from a caucus to a primary, and here's a little bit more information on the difference between a primary and a caucus. So caucus, by their traditional definition, were seen as elitist and anti-democratic. They've changed a lot since their original form, and Iowa still uses a caucus today. Now they're much more open, whereas they used to be much more party-oriented. There's more participation now in caucuses by the average voter, whereas in the past It was just the higher-ups within the party who participated. So the caucuses of today are much more democratic than the caucuses of the 1950s and the 40s. A primary is open to all, no matter the socioeconomic status. They do tend to be more representative. It could be a more rigorous test for candidates. It's almost like they have to win an election before they become the party's candidate. Okay, so here's some information about scheduling. New Hampshire is usually first, usually the first state to go. New Hampshire is a heavily white and conservative state, so that might mean it receives a disproportionate media coverage. Super Tuesday has become a tradition in many states, holding primaries on the same day. It started in the South. There's this idea of front-loading, which is a tendency of states to choose an early date on the primary schedule. Practically every state wants to be the state that's in the news for the results of their primaries or their caucuses, so states want to try to go earlier and earlier in the schedule. 70% of all delegates are now awarded before the end of March. So this could mean that nominees are selected too early. There's clearly an advantage to being the early front-runner, and it also gives an advantage to the candidate with the best fundraising, the candidate who's able to hit the ground running and take advantage of all the funds that are coming in. Which brings up this interesting term called the invisible primary. Especially with front-loading happening, the year or so prior to the start of the official nomination season, where the candidates are out there exploring whether or not they should run, they can begin fundraising and campaigning even before the primary season starts in earnest. So the next stage is the national party conventions. This is the conclusion of the nomination campaign, the nomination season. Usually, the party that is out of power, so the party that is not holding the presidency, goes first, usually in late July. Then the incumbent party goes second, sometime around the middle of August. Conventions have changed a lot from the way that they have been run in the past. There's no more dark, smoke-filled rooms with party officials making deals and picking a dark horse through deal-making. So from the 1830s to the mid-1900s, conventions were under the control of party leaders or kingmakers, people that would pick these dark horses in exchange for a deal. So the early conventions featured many uncommitted delegates who had yet to pledge which candidate they were going to support. So this process enabled a lot of deal-making to happen, where in deal-making, a delegate votes in exchange for some sort of political plum job in politics. So they're very different today. There's less deal-making and compromise today. Before the party convention happens, everybody knows who the nominee is going to be. It's not a surprise. It happens in a much more democratic way, which is a good thing. It's out of the hands of the elite and into the hands of the electorate. Most nominations are selected well in advance of the convention. The very first party convention was in 1831. In 1832, the Democratic National Convention ratified Andrew Jackson, and in 1836, Martin Van Buren became the first non-incumbent candidate from a convention to win the presidency. So how are the delegates selected to attend the National Convention? Well, the primaries or caucuses select the number of delegates that each candidate gets. So party leaders have less control because it's done through a primary or a caucus. Democrats no longer use something called the unit rule, which is a rule that states that this is more of a traditional party practice, that the majority of a state delegation can force the minority to vote for its candidate. So it's in the Democratic National Convention that no longer happens. Democrats do use something called a superdelegate. This is a Democratic Party official. All Democratic governors are superdelegates, and 80% of congressional Democrats are superdelegates as well. They have a reserved spot at the Democratic National Convention. The number of slots for superdelegates has gone up recently. It was added to give the conventions more stability. The theory was that these superdelegates, because they're career politicians, they're professionals, are supposed to be thinking about winning. So they're going to vote for the candidate with the best chance of winning, not amateur ideologues who the thought was would be the regular delegates at the convention. And the impact of these superdelegates is debatable. Some say that the superdelegates don't really have much impact anyway. But the theory was that they would be professional and vote for the best candidate in terms of having the best chance to win, rather than on a purely ideological basis. So who are the delegates that attend these conventions? They have an exceptionally keen interest in politics if they're going to these national conventions. They usually are more left or right than the typical voter, and they're typically more wealthy as well. Democrats have more women and minorities as delegates historically. Republicans are making efforts to address the imbalance. This has to do with the 1986 convention for the Democrats, when the Democrats instituted proportional representation by minority group. And like we mentioned, the Republican National Committee is working to address this imbalance. So the question is then, are moderates in both parties underrepresented, where they tend to be the more extreme elements in either party that goes to the convention? So once the convention happens, well, there's also the role of media. The media coverage is much more extensive today than it has been in the past. So the parties get to launch their candidate with much media fanfare, and it usually results in a boost for that candidate, a short-term boost in the polls that occurs as a result of the party convention. But all that media coverage can also expose rifts within the party, like the 1968 Democratic Convention exposed rifts over the Vietnam War that were played out on national media. Okay, so once the conventions happen, the Electoral College takes place, where representatives of each state cast the final ballots that actually elect the president. Each state can cast one electoral vote for each senator and representative that it has. D.C. has 3 electoral votes, even though it does not have a representative or a senator. So the total is 538. There's 538 electors in the Electoral College. So this is an example of an election where a majority is required. A candidate cannot win the presidency without a majority of votes from electors at the Electoral College. So 270 is needed. The number 538 does come from 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate, and 3 for D.C. The number is adjusted every 10 years based on census results, the number of representatives that each state has. So the Electoral College is mostly a function of compromise at the Constitutional Convention. And before we get into the history of it, let's take a look at this map. You can see that this is from the 2004 presidential election. Red states were for Bush, blue states were for Kerry. And you can see that Virginia, for example, has 13 electors. So that means that Virginia has 11 representatives in the House and 2 senators. And then if a state has lost or gained electors because of population change, then that number is reflected here. So for example, Pennsylvania lost 2 from the 2000 census. Pennsylvania lost population, and maybe those 2 went to Texas or to Arizona. So the general trend in population movement in migration is to move away from the Rust Belt and into the Sun Belt, into these states down here. So just a quick history of the Electoral College. It is based on compromise at the Constitutional Convention. Roger Sherman, Elbridge Gerry, they wanted Congress to pick the president. Congress to do it, not the people. James Madison, James Wilson, and Gouverneur Morris argued for the people to vote for the president. Because no national media existed, citizens would probably have voted for whoever was from their state. So the electors were very educated, and they were capable of making such a decision. It's an example of elitism. The system was constructed to work without political parties, to cover both the nominating and the electing phase, and to produce a non-partisan president. Originally, the electors voted for 2 candidates, with only one allowed from the same state. Whoever got the most votes, provided it was a majority, was the president. Whoever got the second highest vote was the vice president. If 2 candidates tied and got a majority of the electors, then the House of Representatives broke the tie. If no candidate secured a majority, the House would decide on the outcome. Bear in mind that this system was designed without political parties in mind. So if it seems a little bit crazy, it wasn't designed for today's political world. Then in the 1800 election, Burr and Jefferson tied in the vote for president. They were both from the Democratic Republicans. The Electoral College at the time did not provide a way for electors to specify a vote for president and vice president. Everybody knew that Jefferson was the presidential candidate, but only the House could resolve this. So because of that, the 12th Amendment was added to the Constitution, which fixed the 1800 election scenario. And the 12th Amendment was added in 1804. There is a separate election for each office, the president and the vice president. Each elector has 1 vote for each office, and ties are still broken by the House in the House of Representatives by state delegation. So each state gets 1 vote, and its members in the House of Representatives decide which way that state is going to vote. This system has worked well, but there have been controversies. In 1824, John Adams and Andrew Jackson both failed to secure the majority of electoral votes, so the decision went to the House. In 1876, Hayes and Tilden had no majority winner. Again, the House went with Hayes, so the House had to decide it. In 1888, Harrison had less popular votes but more electoral votes. So there have been a few times where the candidate with the smaller popular vote still wins in the Electoral College. So there have been some ideas for what to do to fix the Electoral College. Idea number 1 is to abolish it. Just use the national popular vote. There's been 4 times when a president has won the popular election but not the presidency. So that this would fix that. Although this is not likely, small states have equal representation in the Senate and thus would probably not want to give that up by passing an amendment to abolish the Electoral College. Plus, a national recount is needed. If a national recount was needed, it would be huge to have a recount on a national scale. And this would require a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College, which would be very tough to do. Idea number 2 is the Congressional District Plan. This is used in Maine and Nebraska. The candidate would receive 1 elector for each Congressional District 1 in each state, and 2 more bonus electors for the state senators for winning the popular vote in a state. This would not require a constitutional amendment, since the Constitution gives states the authority to determine how electors are picked. And redistricting would be very, very important. Maybe this would minimize competitive districts, and the candidates would only focus on a limited number of competitive districts. And then one final idea is to keep the college but abolish the electors. It would remove all voting power from the actual human electors. So that basically it would just be a statistical device. The Electoral College would just be a statistical formality. This could remove the problem of faithless electors who change their mind and vote for the other candidate at the college. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Then we get into patterns in presidential elections. Electoral college results reveal a lot. Which party and which regions are coming into dominance. So that brings us into something called critical or realignment periods. A period when a major, lasting shift occurs in the popular coalition supporting one or both sides. The kinds of voters supporting each party change in a critical or realigning period, and the issues that separate the two parties change as well. Here's some examples. In 1800, the Jeffersonian Republicans defeated the Federalists. In 1828, the Jacksonian Democrats came to power. In 1860, the Whig Party collapsed and the Republicans came to power under Lincoln. In 1896, Republicans defeated William Jennings Bryan. And in 1832, Democrats under FDR came to power, as the electorate rejected Hoover and the GOP. So in theory, these realigning or critical elections occur about every 36 years. If so, 1980 would have been a realigning election when Reagan was swept into power. Was he elected, though, just because he was not Jimmy Carter? And maybe it was a realigning election, but the Democrats also controlled the Congress. And 2008, by this 36-year time period, would also have been a critical or realigning election. The South showed signs in 2008 of no longer being solidly Republican, like it was from 1972 to 2008. Okay, that takes us to the end of presidential elections. We covered a lot. Hope it helped, and good luck studying.